We're pleased today to welcome Dr. James Appel, who is with us all the way from the Republic of Chad. He is a graduate of Southern Adventist University in Loma Linda and completed his residency in family practice in California. He has spent the last 12 years working in Chad as a physician, and he's going to be sharing with us today some of his experiences. He's the author of 4 books, one of them being called Ebola Iculus, a physician encounters the Ebola capital of the world, dispatches from a district hospital in Chad, Children of the East, the spiritual heritage of Islam and the Bible, and Messiah, the Jesus of the Quran and the Gospels. I'm sure that we're going to be so excited to hear some of his stories and his experiences. And Dr. Appel is here. His wife and his 3 children are in Chad, and he's enjoying our Michigan weather. Not exactly, it's a little bit different from Chad. So we're glad that he's here, so please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
I got interested in missions at a very early age. One of my great-grandfathers was a missionary to the Philippines and South America. Another one was one of the first missionaries to China. My grandpa was born in China, lived there for 24 years. My own father was born in China and grew up in India. So my twin brother David and I, whenever we would visit Grandpa Alva and Grandma Wilma, we used to love going into their house and seeing all of the artifacts from the East that they had brought. Then I kind of followed a traditional middle-class Adventist upbringing, went to Adventist schools for elementary school, went to Adventist Academy, went on several mission trips in Academy, then went to Adventist University. But I still didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. So after my second year in college, I took a year off as a student missionary, and I went down to South America. I taught PE at an Adventist high school until their summer vacation. Then I went to Brazil and worked on the medical boats on the Amazon with my cousin, who was a nurse. And it was there that I kind of got an interest in the medical possibilities of mission. During that same year, my twin brother David went to Russia and then on to Poland, where he taught English. Our junior year, we both decided to actually go to the same school again, and we went to Pacific Union College, where I switched to pre-med. But switching late, I was unable to apply like most people did, so by the time I finished my degree at Southern Adventist University, I had only applied to one medical school and was put on their waiting list because no one else would accept me as a candidate without having taken the medical college admissions test. So that summer after graduation, I was still in limbo. I didn't know what I was going to do. I had no real possibilities. I moved to Baton Rouge and worked as a volunteer youth pastor living in a school classroom until finally 2 weeks before medical school started, I got a call and said I'd been accepted to Loma Linda. So I went there and got quite a rude awakening as I almost failed my first anatomy and physiology test and barely squeaked through the 4 years of medical school. When I went to family practice residency also, without going into the details, was almost kicked out in my first year, which is really hard to do in family practice. But it made me face the fact that I was responsible for all that God had given me and doing something with it, not just wasting it. And then about halfway through my residency training came September of 2001. Now for most of you, that has a certain meaning. For me, it has a different meaning, because on September 3, my twin brother and I, who had by that time finished his theological seminary training here at this university and was a youth pastor at the Vallejo Drive Church in Southern California, we had decided to drive up to Northern California for one of his friend's wedding. On the way back, it was, I think it's Memorial Day, or was it Labor Day in September, one of those two. And so we were coming back on Monday evening down into Southern California, into Los Angeles on Interstate 5 on this thing called the Grapevine, which is a very steep downward slope from the mountains separating Los Angeles from Central California. And 4 lanes of heavy traffic, and we were going about probably 75 miles an hour in the fast lane. And I was in the back seat with my girlfriend asleep without my seatbelt on, and my brother was in the passenger seat and his girlfriend was driving, when a car swerved into the lane. In order to avoid it, the girl driving tried to turn like this and then tried to regain control. I woke up just as we were fishtailing and right before we flipped 4 times, crossed 3 lanes of traffic, somehow managed to land right side up and not get hit by any of the other cars on the road. Well, as it started to flip, I remember going up to hit the ceiling, and then this voice speaking to me saying, just relax, it'll be over, you'll be fine. I must have passed out because I found myself then awakening with my head down at my brother's feet and kind of across the parking brake and looking up and seeing my brother completely still. And I kind of had a bad feeling, and just at that moment, there was someone else opening back door saying, we got to get him out of there. So we got him out and started doing CPR on him, but as I noticed the pool of blood collecting around his head, I knew it was no use, and so I stopped. And my life kind of changed at that point, and again, it was a moment where I said, hey, I know my brother, he's made his sacrifices, he's right with God. He had just quit his job as a youth pastor because he felt called to go open up a church, plant a church in western Los Angeles where there was no church. He'd given up the security of a safe career in order to follow God. And that inspired me to want to do a similar thing. So about a year later, I got a call from Adventist Health International asking me if I would come to Loma Linda to talk about possibilities of working in the mission field when I finished residency. And I met with Richard Hart and Monita Birch, who was the health director of the Central African Union, and we talked about a hospital in Nigeria that was opening up a family practice residency program. Would I be interested? And then near the end, Monita spoke up and she said, and then we have this small hospital in Chad. We've been trying for the last 10 years to get a doctor to go there. And it was as if I'd just been hit right in the middle of the chest. And they must have seen it because they immediately said, you don't have to decide now. Why don't you go and check it out and see what you think? So I took a month off later on in my third year of residency in November of 2002. I traveled and spent 3 weeks in Nigeria, and it seemed like a perfect place for a young, single, inexperienced doctor. There was other missionary families there. There was other doctors. It was a well-established hospital. But it just didn't feel right. So then I traveled to Chad and ended up getting stuck in Cameroon for 4 days. When I finally made it to Chad on Sunday evening instead of Thursday evening, the vehicle that was supposed to take me down to the hospital was no longer available. So I was put on public transport, which there consists of these small minivans from the 1980s that have been modified to fit 22 passengers in them, and they push-started the van to get it going. I should have known then that there was going to be a problem, and literally every half an hour they were stopping to fiddle with the engine, replace a part, until a normal trip that would have taken us 6 hours had already gone on from 10 in the morning to 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were still several hours from our destination, and they had the whole top of the engine off. So I realized we weren't going anywhere, so the pastor that's accompanying me flagged down another vehicle that was already packed full, and they somehow managed to squeeze us in for the last hour trip to where the pavement ended. And we slept on the cement floor that night. The next morning got on motorcycles and went off-roading until we came to a river where there was no bridge or ferry. So they had these dugout canoes where they stuck the motorcycles in the canoes and paddled you across the river, and we continued on to the hospital. The hospital did not even have a fence. There was pigs and chickens and goats wandering in the hospital wards. The ceilings were falling down, and there was maybe 3 patients in the whole hospital. They had nothing. And yet somehow, again, I just had this feeling, this is right. On the way back, I only spent 5 hours at the hospital because by the time I got there on Tuesday, my flight was leaving on Wednesday to go back to Nigeria. So got back on a bus and started heading back to N'Djamena, the capital. And still about 100 miles from N'Djamena, we stopped on the side of the road. They said, we can't go any further. There's bandits blocking the route. So we went into town, bought some woven mats, laid them down on the ground by the side of the road, and laid down to sleep. And then one by one, all the other passengers came and, without asking permission, laid down next to us on our mats. So I found myself squeezed on this mat, looking up at the stars. No electricity in the town, of course, with strangers surrounding me, and I can't describe it. I remember praying and saying, yeah, this feels right. This is where I'm supposed to be. And it's obviously not logical, but that's how I ended up going to Chad. And when I arrived there in 2004 on a permanent basis, I was still single, but there was a volunteer nurse from Denmark, curly red hair. Needless to say, it didn't take long for me to ask her to marry me. And by the end of 2004, we were married. And a few years later, we'd been continuing to work at the hospital and try and get it up and running. A few years later, we decided, hey, we should have kids. Except that didn't work out too well. So after 7 years of infertility, we decided to try and get some help in Denmark, and we were able to get pregnant in 2010. And it was a little girl, and when she was about 5 months pregnant, suddenly she had a preterm delivery. And I delivered her there in my own bed. Perfect little girl, but she couldn't breathe. And she died a few minutes later. So we buried her in front of our house. And we weren't going to give up so easily, though, so we went again and got some more treatments. And at the end of 2010, my wife was pregnant again, this time with twins, a little boy and a little girl. So they were born in the middle of 2011, Adam and Miriam. And when they were 3 months old, we took them back to Chad. And we were in the process of moving to a new location. We'd spent 7 years at the Barry Adventist Hospital. It had got up running again. It was being taken over by some new doctors. And so the opportunity opened for us to open a surgery center in a nearby town called Mundu. So we moved there, and we're working on getting the equipment installed and getting the place ready to open. And for Christmas, we decided to go to Cameroon, where a couple of our friends, the Shanks, were working as missionary doctors, and we spent a nice Christmas with them. On the way back, we stopped in N'Djamena before going back down to Mundu. That night, it was a Thursday night, it was actually the 2 days before our wedding anniversary. Adam suddenly got a fever of 40 degrees Celsius, which is a conversion 103 or 4 in Fahrenheit. Very high fever. And having lived there for that long, I knew that until proven otherwise, that had to be malaria. So we're staying at a mission guest house, and we took did a rapid malaria test, came back negative. I wasn't convinced. So we decided to go down to the Barry Adventist Hospital instead and get a malaria smear done. If my kids were going to be sick and treated, I wanted them to be treated at what I felt was the best place in Chad for them to be treated. So sure enough, on Friday, we arrived down in Barry, and Friday afternoon got the malaria test, and both Adam and Miriam had malaria. So we started them on the quinine drips, and overnight they did well. The next morning, they were up in their little mosquito tents. They were kind of playing as 6-month-olds do. And we started giving them the second drip, and almost immediately, then Sarah, my wife, turned to me and said, "Did Adam just have a seizure?" And I looked over, and my little boy was not breathing. So I started doing CPR. I called in Olin Netteberg, who was the doctor who had taken over from us, and we worked on him for about 45 minutes with the best that we had there available, but to no avail. So I buried my second child in front of my house there in Chad. Now, many people were extremely supportive, but there was always a few who asked the question that probably everyone else was asking: why would you take a 3-month-old kid to a place like Chad? Didn't you know he could get malaria and die? Well, of course. I mean, I'd seen how many hundreds of Chadian children die of malaria in those years. But how many also had I saved? And so my wife and I wrestled with that, of course, and we spent many sleepless nights and a lot of tears wetting the floor. And finally we came to the conclusion that, true, of course, if we had stayed in the States, Adam probably, now we couldn't guarantee, but he probably would still be alive. But how many Chadian children would be dead? And so then we started to ask, well, do we start to value the life of our child? How many Chadian children now what worth do we place on our child's life? How many Chadian children would we have to save before we felt it was worthwhile? You may not like to hear that kind of question, But that's reality. Because if we weren't there, so what kind of decision? And we decided that our child was very important to us, but in God's sight, he was no more valuable than any Chadian child. And so it suddenly brought a verse that I'd always kind of wondered about into clarity for me, and that's found in Mark 10:29-31. Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, there is no one who has left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the gospel who will just get an eternal reward." Is that what it says? Actually, it says, who will not receive right now, in this age, 100 times as much. Homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, fields, all with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first. You see, by going to Chad, by taking that risk, we had gained, because we'd saved hundreds and hundreds of Chadian children, and they have become, in a way, our children, because we have now an eternal connection with those children that we saved. We've gained over 100 children in this life. And in the life to come, guess what? It's a temporary separation, because we believe death is asleep. So Adam is not suffering somewhere, and he's not growing up somewhere. He's waiting for us so that we can have the opportunity to watch him grow up in the best environment possible. Do you think he's going to regret not having lived 80 or 90 years on this planet? So we get blessings in this age, and we get him in the age to come. And God has given us 2 other sons unexpectedly. Not that that can replace him, but it's a bonus because we haven't lost him. We've just been separated temporarily. When we went back to the States in early 2014, we were in another transition. People had taken over for us in Mundu after spending 2 years there, and now we were moving to Eastern Chad to try and open another hospital there. And we came back on vacation, and Sarah found she was pregnant unexpectedly because, of course, we'd had problems, but this one was just happened, a bonus. And so we'd all planned on going back in July, but since she was pregnant, Sarah and Miriam and Noah stayed in the States where I went back to Chad. And after being there for 2 weeks, I was sitting on a mat in my Muslim friend's house, Yaqub Abdullahi, and we were drinking tea as usual and just chit-chatting, and we were actually talking about Ebola, and they were afraid, what if it comes to Chad? What are we going to do? And it was at that moment that I got a call. I don't get too many international calls when I'm in Chad. And I don't hear many people speaking in English when I'm in Chad either, and I got both of these, and it was my boss, Richard Hart, Dr. Hart, calling from Loma Linda saying, "James, we have this hospital in Monrovia." And the surgeon there, we kind of told her to leave, but she refused. And so now it's one of the few hospitals that's still open in the capital of Liberia, and she's being overwhelmed. Can you go? Now, my first thought was, no way. I've heard of Ebola in medical school. I just remember a brief mention, but man, my thinking, I don't ever want to be anywhere near that. I know how to avoid most other things. I'm not afraid of most other things. I know how to either treat it or avoid it. Ebola, I don't know how to either avoid it or treat it if I'm around it. But then once again, that same thinking, if I don't go to Liberia, there's probably going to be some Liberians that are going to die. So if I go and I die, how many Liberians will I have to saved before I feel that it's worth it. Again, that's comparison. How much is my life worth? How much is their life worth? And then it became clear. Again, my life is no more valuable than any Liberian's life. No matter how much I may be egotistical and think it is, it's not. And so I figured if I saved one Liberian life, even if I died of Ebola, it was going to be worth it. So I went. Now, it doesn't mean that I wasn't afraid. I was petrified. I didn't hardly sleep the whole time. I spent half my time dumping bleach all over myself, taking showers, crying on the floor, and saving lives and having an amazing experience. But you see, God doesn't call us to only go places that we're not afraid to go to. He doesn't also promise to take away our fear, but he says, don't be paralyzed by your fear. Master your fear. Don't let your fear master you. When I come back to this country, I see that Americans in general, we live in fear. Almost every decision we make is tempered by some kind of fear. We're afraid of everything, and it's paralyzing us. I don't know what you're afraid of today. Only you can answer that question. But don't let it paralyze you and keep you from doing what you know you're supposed to do. Hebrews 2:14-15 says, therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, Jesus likewise shared in their humanity. Why? So that through death he could destroy the one who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and set free those who are held in slavery all their lives by their fear of death. Don't be held in slavery. Be free from fear. It's okay to feel that fear, but don't give into it. And you'll live a life that'll be beyond your wildest dreams as far as what you will have experienced and done. Don't be held a slave to your fear. I didn't tell people that I was going to Liberia before I went because I knew what they would say. Of course, my wife knew. My boss was smart. He actually called her first and asked her permission before calling me. And she was fine with it, of course, which makes me wonder sometimes. But I didn't tell anyone else because I knew they would all say, don't go, it's not safe. It's not safe. That's almost the first question that almost every single person who contacts us and wants to come as a volunteer, it's the first question they ask. Now, Chad, is it safe? And at first, I used to always try and, well, of course, yeah, this explain and try and, calm. And then after a while, I started saying, no, it's not safe. Where is safe anyway? Are you safe here? People in Loma Linda University probably thought they were safe until San Bernardino happened. I'm sure I used to not think about driving on highways until my brother was killed, whereas I've been in Africa for 12 years and I'm alive. Where is safe? Where are you really safe? And why are we even asking that as believers, as followers of Jesus? Why are we even asking that question? I mean, do you think Jesus asked that question before coming down to this planet? Hey, guys, what do you think? Is Earth safe? And they'd look at him, no. They're going to hound you your whole life. They're going to persecute you, and finally they're going to torture you and kill you. What do you think you're going down there for? It's not safe? Do you think the Apostle Paul asked that question before going out somewhere? Hey guys, is Athens safe? Corinth, Ephesus, are these safe places? I mean, the guy got stoned, beat up, put in prison. Of course it wasn't safe. Since when has that been the criteria for determining where we go? Revelation 12:11. But they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, they did not love their lives so much that they were afraid to die. So what are you willing to die for? It seems like some people are willing to die for something. They're looking for something. That's why young people are flocking to join ISIS. Why don't we give them an option of something good to die for? Because living your life good, yeah. I feel like I'm living my life good, not being afraid of sacrificing things, of not being afraid, but I want to die well too, because if you live well but you die poorly, following God's plan for your life is not safe, but it's a wild adventure. You'll go places you'll never have imagined, you'll get opportunities you could have never dreamed. And in the end, all those things, other things you thought you were looking for, safety, security, nice place to live, surrounded by your family and friends, that all comes later. I'm not missing out on that, just temporarily putting it aside. We don't think anything about, people who invest in business are always looking for the long-term, benefits, the returns, getting some money. But how come we can't think about the future and invest in something that's really going to last? Many of you, if you're students, you're at the point where you're going to determine what direction your life is going to go. And did you know that if you're typical Americans, listen to these statistics, 1 in 10 of you will be unemployed, 1 in 10 will have major depression if you haven't already had it, 4 in 10 will have some type of anxiety disorder, and 4 in 10 will get divorced if you ever actually even get married. And no matter how much money you make, the statistics show that if you anything more than $75,000 per household won't make you any happier. So if you live your life pursuing the American dream, just going to be another statistic. But if you live a life of self-sacrifice, free of fear, and not so concerned about your safety, but realizing that the only safe place is exactly where God wants you to be, you're going to live a life that's abundant, and you're going to live this life to its fullest. So it's not just how we live, but it's how we die that matters. It's interesting that we look up to American soldiers who give their lives in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere for this country as heroes, and we applaud them. But when a believer goes someplace dangerous and lays down his life, or there's casualties that happen, we think he's a fool. So what I'm trying to tell you is that no matter what cultural, religious background, whatever it is, it's a simple rule of life that when you sacrifice for the good of others, you face your fears, you don't follow the safe path, it's going to lead you to contentment, fulfillment, and happiness. And if you happen to be committing your life to God as well, you not only get that 100 times more in this life, but you do get eternal life in the future. So, following God's plan for your life is not safe, but it is worth it.